we are going to be talking about meaningful grammar practice today. And so what does that mean exactly, meaningful grammar practice? We're going to talk about that. And part of the objectives that we're going to have for this session are, first, I want to help you understand the grammar acquisition process and what that means for you as a teacher. So there are some things that affect what you do in the classroom. And so having a solid understanding or reviewing that is what we're going to do first. Then we're going to talk about realistic and appropriate goals for teaching grammar. What can you realistically expect from your students? We're also going to talk about some characteristics of effective grammar practice activities, and then distinguish between mechanical activities and meaningful activities. What are the differences there? And then we're going to work on transforming some mechanical grammar activities into meaningful grammar activities to kind of give you some ideas of that and some practice. So that's what we're hoping you'll get out of the session. So let's first talk about the grammar acquisition process. And basically what we're saying is, you know, how do we acquire language and how do we acquire grammar? What happens in our brains as we're trying to learn a second language or, you know, a first language in some cases? To think about what are the similarities and differences between how you acquire language as a baby and then how you acquire language as an adult. There are some similar things that happen in your brain, but also some different things that we should take into consideration as we think about teaching grammar. So this is an image from Rod Ellis, who's done a lot of work with grammar acquisition. And in his kind of conception and based on research, the things that are necessary for acquiring language are these particular things. So first there has to be input. And you think about that as a baby. Babies are listening all the time to their parents speaking to the language that's being used around them. There's a lot of rich input. And we also need to provide that input to our students. So they need to be exposed to a lot of the target language. Then after that input is coming, there needs to be some noticing done on the part of the student. This is what he refers to as intake. So being able to take that input and notice something about it, notice patterns, start to notice words that mean certain things or structures that tend to mean certain things. As that intake is processed, it becomes sort of two types of knowledge or awareness in the brain. The first is explicit knowledge. And so that explicit knowledge is sort of conscious knowledge about the language. So you know about the different grammar structures that are happening and you're able to explain the rules of that grammar structure. So in English, you know, the past tense is typically formed by adding a D or ed at the end of a word, and being able to explain that, which I'm not doing a very good job of at the moment. Okay, but implicit knowledge then is sort of what a lot of native speakers have about their own language. It's that you know what is right and wrong and you're not quite sure why it's right or why it's wrong, but it just feels right or wrong. And so as native speakers of a language, we typically have that implicit knowledge. And our job as language educators and teachers is to kind of help students push them from that explicit knowledge to that implicit knowledge, helping them to create systems of implicit knowledge. And then finally, the result of all of this is then output. So you can see evidence of the student's knowledge, what they've taken in, et cetera, and what they're able to say, the language that they're able to produce. Okay, so this is kind of related a little bit to two terms, procedural memory and declarative memory. And so procedural memory is kind of similar to implicit knowledge, but this is sort of a long-term memory. It's knowing how to do things. A lot of times it's not even conscious, like we all know how to breathe, but we're often not conscious of how it happens. It just happens. And a lot of times it's based on past experience. So an example of that would be riding a bike. You know, they say you never forget. Once you know how to ride a bike, you never forget how to ride a bike, right? That's contrasted to declarative memory, which can be short-term or can be long-term. Maybe if it's something that you've had a lot of experience with, like your childhood phone number, if you can always remember, you know, the phone number that you had as a child. Or it could be short-term if you're trying to remember the number to the pizza place and you just kind of remember it just to type it into your phone. It's the ability to recall facts or concepts. It also includes your memory of events and how they happened, and these things are consciously recalled. So an example of that would be trying to remember which bike on the bike rack is yours. So if it's been a while since you've been on your bike and you're like, I think it's this one, that would be declarative memory. And so as students are building language, they're relying on both procedural memory and declarative memory. So we want them to know how to do things, not just know how to talk about how to do things in the language. So one of the questions is, why do my students still make mistakes after learning the rules? I've explained it to them a lot. They have had a lot of opportunity to practice, but they're still making mistakes. One of the explanations is this process that happens in your brain as you're trying to learn a language. And maybe as you think about how you've learned a second or a third language, you can relate to this kind of process. So the idea is that as you are learning the language, inside your brain, you're constructing rules for that language. And the rules that you're constructing in your brain may or may not be aligned with the rules that actually, the rules that the language functions with. So we notice things, we try things out, and we hypothesize in our brain. This is called an inner language. So we have our own understanding of what a language's rules are. So when you teach your students something, they're kind of at the side here, on the left side of this curve. You teach them something and the student understands the rule and they do really well in class, but after a while they start making mistakes. What happens is that the student has to take the rule that now they've learned explicitly, and they have to use that to restructure the rules that they have in their mind, which may not be accurate. So they have to restructure their understanding. And then during that restructuring process, sometimes they take old rules and they overgeneralize it and they make mistakes. So here they have, he is taking a cake. And then as they're in the process of restructuring, they might not use the ing correctly and they just say, he take a cake. So they're trying to reconcile what is in their head with the rules that they've learned. And that can be kind of a messy process. But over time, you can see here, as the student progresses, as they get more input and more practice, then they're able to then again return to the proper form. He is taking a cake. So this process just takes time, and it's something that all of us have to kind of go through as we're trying to learn language, either as a child or as an adult. So one thing to note though is that fossilization can occur during this curve. So it's possible that your student might be taught the rule here, and then they get somewhere over here and they get stuck. And one thing that might contribute to that is if the student is able to be understood without having to say the correct form, if this is good enough to get his meaning across, then he or she may never have to fully change their inner language. So that's one of the reasons why it's really important to pair teaching grammar with with meaning and making sure that the students see a real communicative purpose and a reason why they have to memorize the grammar rules. Okay. So that's a lot of information about what's happening in your brain, but what does that mean for me as a teacher? So first, the bad news. Research has shown that explicit teaching of grammar has little effect on students' ability to acquire the language. So no matter what you do as a teacher, how clear your explanations are, how much practice you give, eventually it's going to have a little effect on the student's ability to acquire the language. If some of these things that we've talking about here aren't happening, if they're not having a chance to experience enough input to notice things, if they're not practicing enough and rearranging their inner language. So there's only so much that you as a teacher can do. But the good news is, by understanding what's happening in their brain and using the right approach, we can help students to obtain explicit knowledge about the language, so our explanations will help them while they're building the implicit knowledge of the language. So the students have to do the internal building, and we as teachers can help support them and give them the proper knowledge so that they can, you know, not just start here or stay here, but finally get back to a place where they can use the language more naturally, kind of automatically and correctly. So, so some other takeaways.
Forms. What is noticed forms?
Noticed forms here under intake. So that's of all of the input that the student is receiving, everything that they're hearing or reading. Those are the things that they notice. So they notice when a vocabulary means, they notice when a vocabulary word means a certain thing, or they notice, they're always, you know, the verb always comes at the end of the sentence.
Okay.
In Hindi, you know, so like what they notice about it, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great, thanks for the question, Tamara. So as a teacher, kind of the takeaways from this process is we need to remember that grammar learning is more than rule memorization. So students can learn rules, but that's not really going to help them speak more accurately. Also, students will make mistakes. It's just a natural part of the learning process. And so helping them remember that is important as well. That they shouldn't be discouraged if they make mistakes. Next, the role of input is really important. The more input that a student can get, especially input that's understandable to them, is going to help them get through this process a lot better.
Too noisy you are.
Also, grammar needs to be taught in context. So, there should always be some kind of context or meaning. You should never just teach grammar by itself, but it needs to be surrounded in a meaningful context. And then, again, to prevent fossilization or sort of getting stuck before students have been able to complete that cycle, students need to have a need. They have to understand the need for the grammar in order to acquire it. So there has to be something that they want to communicate, and that they are going to need that grammatical form to be able to communicate it in order for them to really cement it. Okay, and then finally, during this process, students need a lot of meaningful practice. And that practice is going to help them develop that implicit knowledge and that procedural memory as they're trying to do all of these things. Okay. So with these things in mind, what we've discussed about the grammar acquisition process, what do you think the goal of teaching grammar in your class should be? So you can go ahead and use the chat feature to type in some ideas of what you think some realistic goals, reasonable goals of teaching grammar in your class should be.
How do we use the chat here? Okay, I see it. I see it. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Well, I don't see anything. But anyway, if we deal with adults and they know their own language or maybe some other foreign language, they already know what's the meaning of the grammar and what's the goal of the grammar. So that's why they need it in order it's not just a number of words they do know, but it would be an expression, an idea, a thought to express. That's what they need grammar for.
So Tamara, you're saying helping them relate the grammar in the second language with what they already know in the first language and how it functions that way is a good goal. Okay, good. So Valentina says helping them use grammar in appropriate situations. That's good. That it should be practical, what they're seeing in conversation or in the news. Help students with the basics, and then help them on delivering the task with the right grammar. Yeah, so here we're seeing the idea of a task, that there's a purpose and a goal for the grammar. Okay, to be able to communicate in simple sentences, yeah. And I'm seeing a lot of good ideas here, right? That the goal should be communication, etc. Now, this is going to be easy for you, I think, but which set of goals are more realistic? Okay, goal A, students will learn the rules of the new language, understand how to manipulate a structure, gain full control of target structures, and achieve 100% accuracy when communicating. Okay, or B, students will be able to apply the rules of the language. Students will understand what a structure means and when to use it. Students will gain awareness of target structures, and students will improve accuracy in order to communicate meaningfully. Okay, I'm seeing several people in the chat indicating column B.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think any goal of expecting the student to get 100% accuracy is, you know, it's just not realistic. It's not going to happen. And so I think
do it in our own language.
Exactly, right? Yeah, we can't even do that in our first language. And so I think a lot of the idea of this, the goals of grammar instruction, not just for you as teachers, but for your students as well, helping them set a realistic expectation for themselves, that it's okay when they make mistakes. The idea is that we're trying to learn how to apply the rules, understanding when to use things, and you know, improve your accuracy, but not expect 100% from themselves. So let's talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of effective grammar practice, what research has shown. So these characteristics were taken from Penny She wrote a book kind of in the ESL, the English as a second language context, on grammar activities. She's kind of one of the experts in the ESL field. And these were things that she identified as important elements of effective grammar practice. So first, pre-learning. Before we expect students to practice grammar, they need to have learned the grammar, right? So there needs to be sufficient support and guidance from you as the teacher before throwing them into the practice in order for students to get the most benefit from it. Okay. Second, there needs to be volume and repetition. So by volume, it's not sort of the noise level, but the amount, right? So there needs to be a lot of examples and a lot of opportunities to practice. So giving students, you know, what you have in your textbook with sort of 5 sentences that they have to manipulate, that's not going to be enough for them. You need to give them a lot of things. Okay, number 3 is success orientation. And what that means is that the activities that you give the students help them to be successful. Why is this important? Grammar isn't every student's favorite subject. It's not their favorite part of language. And if they feel that they're failing in grammar practice activities, then their motivation is going to go down even further. So you want to have activities that have a lot of opportunity for the students to succeed, that they can feel like they're doing something right.
You should set students for success always, for any field of language, any part of it. It's just a general idea to set them for success. That's
true. That is true. That is important for all different aspects. Thank you for pointing that out. This next one is heterogeneity. And this is important if you have multiple students. So some of you just have one student, and you can kind of tailor the activities for that one student. But if you have students in your class who have differing abilities, it's good to use activities that work for students' differing abilities. So students who can do more are able to do more, and students who can only do a little bit, they're also able to do just that little bit, but both successfully. Okay, so having activities that are flexible in that way. The next characteristic is teacher assistance. So this is kind of helping the student realize that you as the teacher are there to help and to support them, and your role isn't only to scold and correct them. So sort of that, you know, stereotype of getting hit with the roller every time you make a mistake or something like that, you know. I don't think that's an issue with any of our teachers, but the idea is you're there to help and support. And then finally, interest. So activities should be interesting, and there needs to be some sort of intrinsic interest in completing the activity itself. So the student has to get some benefit out of completing the activity, which may or may not be the case with multiple choice, a list of multiple choice items or sentence manipulation. So building an activity where there's something that is going to motivate the student to finish. So these are the things that are identified as important characteristics of effective grammar practice. Okay, now in this workshop, we're going to add another layer onto that, and that's that meaningful aspect. So we're talking about meaningful grammar activities. And in order to do that, it's important for us to address grammar within meaningful communicative contexts. So in addition to all of these other things, there needs to be some sort of context that helps the student understand why they're doing all of these things and all of this practice. So characteristics of meaningful grammar practice. First, that grammar is addressed within a meaningful context. And in order to do that, the presentation and the practice of the grammar should be tied to some kind of input, the input that the student is receiving. We want to tie the presentation and the explanation, and then also the practice activities to the context that we gave them when we first gave them the input to notice the grammar, okay? Second, the grammar being practiced is essential to complete a meaningful task. And I saw that in one of your comments in the goals of grammar. I can't remember who said it, it might have been Frederica, that you're teaching them something that is essential to the task. So the practice activities need to prepare the learners to complete some sort of task later. And then this also helps with student motivation, because they're motivated to learn and use the grammar because they can see and connect it to that real communicative need. So they understand why they're doing it. Okay, and then finally, the third one is students are guided toward an understanding of how the grammar functions. So the focus isn't primarily on the rule, but the focus is on what the structure means and how it is used. So if we look at a couple of Penny Er's characteristics of effective grammar practice, and we think about how to make it meaningful, in the pre-learning phase, so in the presentation of the grammar that you give before you get to the practice activities, the grammar should always be seen and heard in context before being presented. This presentation can be inductive or deductive. How many of you are familiar with what that means, inductive or deductive? You can use the thumbs up or give me a thumbs up if you understand what that is. If not, okay. So I'm not seeing a lot of thumbs up. That's okay. Basically, this is how the grammar is presented. So in a deductive approach, you as the teacher just explain the grammar. You just give them the explanation as it is, and they see it, they read it, and then you give them examples and practice from there. With an inductive approach, you give students examples first from the input, and then maybe you highlight those examples, and then you help the students recognize patterns in the grammar, so that the students kind of come to the rule with your help and support and questions along the way, but rather than being told the rule outright, they're kind of led to the rule. Does that make sense? That distinction?
Do you remember Sherlock Holmes, who used deduction?
Yes.
And not induction? Deductive methods, well then.
Yeah, and I have trouble with these terms sometimes too, like trying to remember which one is which. But I think the point is, are you going to explicitly state the rule, or are you going to let the student discover the rule? And so this sort of discovery approach, the inductive approach, it might help students process the rules more deeply if they're doing that work to understand and to notice and things like that. This approach does take a little more time. Sometimes it's more efficient, and if it's an easy, simple rule, it might just be simpler to present it and move on. So that's something that you as a teacher can decide, when the situation is right to use which approach. But in either approach in the presentation, the examples that you're using should come from the input. So whatever authentic task or conversation or something that you presented at the beginning, all of the grammar examples should come from that, and they should be connected. And then your explanation should not only focus on the form, but also how it's used and what it means. Okay, so giving that student that application to say, not just this is how you form the passive voice in my language, but this is how you form it, and this is why it's used and when it's used. Okay, so with meaningful volume and repetition, again, the example should come from the input, and maybe the student is going to need more examples than only what is in the input. So additional examples should be connected to the topic of the input, and also the language required to perform the task. So there should be a connection between the input and the task, and the grammar examples should all kind of align with that. Okay, to have meaningful success orientation and heterogeneity, one thing to consider is that you can avoid activities where there's only one correct answer. And so you can opt for open-ended activities so students can provide as much or as little language as they can. And this also tends to be a little more meaningful as well. Why? Because if you have just sentences where they have to complete a sentence or fill in the gap, there's not a whole lot of meaning there. But if you give students open-ended activities, they're actually having to produce things, they can express what they want, and so those activities tend to be a little more meaningful as well. Okay. So an example of this also comes from Penny She shows that, the first one, Jenny is a baby, so she blank go to school. And the student has to select the correct verb. A better example, if they're trying to practice that negative doesn't go, is you can give them a prompt. Jenny is a baby, so she doesn't go to school. What else doesn't she do? And then that way the students have a chance to produce things. Higher ability students can produce more, maybe in more complex things. Lower ability students probably still can answer the question, just maybe with simpler sentences and things like that. So this is an example of showing that contrast there between open and closed activities, and then also things where there's only one correct answer. Okay. All right, so now let's look at some examples of mechanical versus meaningful. So this is part of a pre-learning activity, and this is the first activity that the students encounter in the grammar section. Does this look like it's meaningful or mechanical? Is it meaningful?
Smooth.
You can use the chat if you want to.
So what do I supposed to do? I'm sorry.
So just say if you think that it is meaningful or not. Is this a meaningful pre-learning activity?
If our students know the word subject, which they often don't, then it's one thing. But sometimes coming after school, they don't know what is subject. Well, it's not a big problem, of course, but
That's true. Sometimes students don't even know the basic grammar terms. Yeah. I'm seeing in the chat a lot of people saying that this is mechanical, and you're right. Yes. So this example is not a meaningful pre-learning activity. And so why is it mechanical? It's not meaningful. This is the very first activity, and the concept is not prevented with meaningful input. There's no input behind this. And you can also see, you know, you're talking about a builder and then a company. There's not a single theme connecting things. It's just sort of random examples, right? So this one is more a mechanical pre-learning activity. Okay. How about this one? Does this look like a meaningful pre-learning or way to kind of introduce or set up the grammar teaching moment?
Yes.
Okay, we've got a very firm yes. And I would agree, yes. So then the question is why? Like, why is this meaningful pre-learning? Okay, so we have
the better introduction.
Go ahead.
Content. It's a better introduction and content.
Yes, so there's context there in the introduction, right? Yeah. And here we're again studying passive voice, but yeah, there's context provided, and the students are able to see the form in context. Okay, and so then how about this? Is this a meaningful practice activity?
oh, no, this is mechanical.
No, it's mechanical. Okay, and so why is it mechanical?
Yeah, you follow the example, you follow the pattern without, well, thinking about maybe the just real meaning of that form. Yeah.
Yeah, there's not really much connection to meaning at all. It's just really manipulating the verb form, right? And so none of the sentences are really related to each other. You've got a lot of different themes and topics happening. And yeah, the students don't have to provide any sort of meaningful information here. So this is definitely a mechanical practice. Okay, and then how about this one? Is this one meaningful or mechanical?
It wasn't, don't look at it. The forms and the contract to remember the whole sentence. What is this a meaningful activity?
Yeah, it's just a meaningful activity. Any ideas?
What text shouldn't we look at?
Okay. It was the text that we showed you before. Okay, I see a few people saying that it's meaningful. So this one, okay, meaningful. This one I said it might be meaningful. Maybe it's meaningful. It is connected with the topic of the input. So we had that paragraph on Coca-Cola and its founding, etc. But I still had a couple questions. My questions were, you know, are the students communicating in a real way in this activity?
No.
They're just kind of recalling information, right?
Right.
And then my also question is it connected to the final task? So maybe think about, you know, is this prepping them for the final task in some way. And I didn't have the answer to that question. But one thing that we could do, you know, is if to maybe make it more meaningful is, you know, if you have a final task of describe the history of a popular target region product, be sure to include the passive voice in your description. So you can maybe see how practicing saying the sentences about Coca-Cola in the passive voice would prepare the students to do this final task. Then that might make it even more meaningful. So this one's kind of a tricky one. Okay, but remember, meaningful activities are connected to both the input and also the final product as they're practicing the grammar. Okay, are mechanical activities always bad? What do you guys think?
Depends on the student.
Okay.
Very often, because if he has that type of mind that is good when he is just drilled and repeats, and there are students like that, it works for them. But many, like they are, it may be meaning gold. They should understand what they're saying every time.
Yeah, good. So Tamara, you say it depends on the student. Any other thoughts about whether these activities, mechanical activities, okay. So Marcella says no, they're not always bad. Tiga says perhaps in the beginning. Would either of you like to expand on your comment?
Me?
Sure.
Did you ask me to expand?
Sure, Tiga, yeah.
Well, maybe at the initial stage of acquisition, it would be beneficial to them be a little bit mechanical, I think, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
If I make any sense. Huh?
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. And we're having a couple helps too. Frederica says drills help to memorize the endings and the patterns. So as students are first learning something, these kind of mechanical practices can really be helpful. And so, yeah, when the student is learning the grammar for the first time, it's okay. So I don't want you to take away from this, never ever use any mechanical practices, but if you're going to give students something really mechanical, it's probably better for them to do it in the homework and for you to try and spend a little more time in the class, either doing oral practice that is a little bit more mechanical. So written practice, especially that's mechanical, I would avoid in the classroom. So if you're going to kind of do drill type things in class, try and keep it oral. But you know, really truly mechanical things, maybe try and keep that for work the student's going to do independently or outside of class, and save class time for real communication if possible. So yeah, those are just some thoughts on that. Now we want to get into some examples of transforming mechanical grammar into meaningful grammar. And Valentine says if they do their homework. Yeah, we'll see if the students do their homework. That is always a good point. So a lot of times, the activities that are in your textbook are very mechanical in nature. And so one thing that I tried to do in this section is take some pretty common standard activities that you might see in a textbook and give a couple ideas on how to make them a little bit more meaningful, so that you can take the activities that are in the textbook, maybe do those, but then follow on with a more meaningful activity, or replace them with something else entirely that might be a little more interesting. So here we have a textbook activity, fill in the blank. This one is working on conditionals, so if, then kind of statements, and the students are supposed to fill in the verb in parentheses in the proper form in order to do this. So this is kind of a pretty standard activity. You see a lot of this kind of a thing in a textbook, right? So one way that you could adapt this Or make a more meaningful practice as a follow-up activity is to do a sentence completion activity. So if you're practicing, say, conditionals in your language, you can give the students a sentence starter using the conditional if we get out of class early, and then students can finish the sentence with whatever they choose. So this is a little bit more meaningful, right? Because it's a little more open-ended. Students are able to communicate exactly what they want. And if you have a series of these sentences, if they're all kind of connected to the theme of what you're talking about for the day, then that will really make it meaningful. And if you are sort of doing isolated sentences, if they're building toward the topic of sort of the end goal, the productive activity that you want, then that is also going to be great. Another option is you can switch it around and do it the other way. You give students the results. I will go for a long walk if, and then they fill in sort of if this happens or if that happens, whatever. So a lot of times, fill in the blank activities, you can kind of make them a little more meaningful by doing a sentence completion activity instead. Okay. A lot of times we have kind of a multiple choice activity or something where students sort of indicate or, you know, have to choose which one is correct or something like that. For this particular multiple choice activity with adverbs, an adaptation of this could be a survey. Now I know if you only have like one student in your class, it might be hard for them to survey. They could survey you and ask different questions. You could also give them an optional activity for homework where they could survey their family or survey friends or survey, you know, other things if they're going to do it outside of class, where they're dealing with the same forms of often, never, sometimes, etc. But they're actually collecting information that's real from real people, that then after they collect that information, they can report back. So they can speak and practice not only asking questions and understanding the answers, but also then producing it and practicing it that way later. Okay. A lot of times, there are questions. Again, this is sort of a sentence transformation activity where you have a question, and in this case, they're telling students you have to answer in the negative. So this one's a little bit mechanical because it's about people that are made up, things like that, and it's requiring the students to give a negative response. So an adaptation of this kind of thing, if you want to practice questions and answers, is to do an interview. And so the purpose, then you would want to choose a topic that you're going to be interviewing about. And if you as the teacher kind of want to guide this so that the students are really going to be able to target that particular grammar form, you could ask questions that you know are going to require it, right? So in this case, it's negative. You want them to answer negative responses. You could come up with a list of questions that have negative answers. You know, based on the student, you know, knowing the student thinks that they would answer negatively. But you might also mix in other ones, you know, that might have a positive response. You don't know. And then you could allow the students to add additional questions. So then they could conduct the interview either with a classmate or with you as the teacher. So then you could ask them the questions, they could ask you the questions, switch roles, and then you could have the student report on the results. So as they're asking and answering the questions in the interview process, as they're exchanging that information, they're practicing the form that you are focusing on. But then again, as they're reporting the results of the interview, then that also is an opportunity for them to practice. Okay. We also have sometimes picture description activities. So in this particular French textbook, they're practicing plural nouns. So you can see there are two of everything in all these pictures, and the students are having to practice making the plural. But this is pretty mechanical in that you have just sort of random words that maybe they've used that they're practicing the plural of. So a better adaptation or description would be, or an adaptation would be a description with some context, right? So think about words that you want them to practice, but also sort of the topic. And maybe you're talking about housing. So if you think about, you know, as you describe your house, there are singular and plural things that you talk about. So there are 3 bedrooms, there's 1 bathroom, there's, you know, 1 kitchen, there's 1 floor, things that have singular and plurals that would be a real task. So you could give them a floor plan like this that they could describe the number of doors, windows, rooms, things like that. Or better yet, to make it really meaningful, they could talk about their own home or different houses that they've lived in. I had an apartment. It had, you know, there was, you know, if they can't speak in past, they could speak in present, you know, my apartment has this, blah, 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 my house has this, you know, and there are a lot of other types of ways that you could do sort of a picture description or a description activity that is not as mechanical. Another one I was thinking about for plurals was maybe a recipe description. If you're talking about making a recipe and you need to make a shopping list, I need 2 apples, I need 3 bananas, things like that could be another kind of descriptive activity that would practice that same plural kind of concept. Okay. Sentence ordering. How many of you have sentence ordering activities in your textbook? They show up all the time, right? Where they have jumbled sentences and students have to put them in order to practice word order. In this case, they're practicing superlatives. So trying to figure out how to form superlative sentences. So maybe an adaptation would be comparing like real things rather than just dealing with what they give you. So you could identify a context. Say, for example, you're comparing countries and you choose 3 items. And you could have the students compare different aspects of those real things. So they're communicating real information about real items. And then they have to form the superlative in a more natural way as they're comparing these things. So it could be countries, could be maybe 3 ads they're comparing, you know, 3 foods, talking about which one is the healthiest or something like that. But using real context, real content is helpful. Okay. Okay, and then kind of another sentence transformation activity is, you know, taking a statement and transforming it into a question. So in this case, they're practicing yes or no questions. A better way to do that would be maybe doing a guessing game where they're practicing the form, but they're actually trying to communicate real information. So the game 20 questions, you know, where you can only ask yes or no questions might be better because you're actually communicating information to try and figure out which item in the room you're talking about.